Hi, and welcome.
Who edits this, by the way? Which one of you guys edits this?
Welcome to the next episode of Bones and Stones. Today we have a postdoc from UCT, Nic Zachariou. You can pronounce his surname whichever way you want. No one actually knows how to pronounce it.
I don't know.
Nick knows. Nick, do you know?
I don't know. I have like four. I say it four different ways. It depends on
your mood,
and
right?
how I feel that day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd have specific. Like if I was on the beach, I'd probably say it one way. If I was shopping, I'd vary it as much as I could. Yeah.
No, I do.
So Nick's joined us from UCT to chat a bit about his work and also being a postdoc, which is something that Nick's got a bit of experience in. So to kick things off, Nic, don't want to sort of put words in your mouth, but can you tell us about the work you do, about the historic archaeology that you do?
So I'm what you would call an historical archaeologist, though there's a lot of debate about what that actually means. I teach the course. Well, I taught the course for third year as the historical archaeology course at UCT, and I always try and define what historical archaeologists do is not really constrained by time per se, because I think the typical view is kind of like, oh well, it's when South Africa was a colony, when the Dutch first arrived. It's that time period, and it kind of is, but I'd like to think of it more as a process, or a way of thinking of a process, in that our methodology takes in a lot of different sources. So we're using a lot of stuff, so there's archaeology, there's the written word, there's oral histories, anthropological approaches, cultural sociology, all that kind of stuff. And also, science, archaeometrics, all those things kind of come into it. So it's basically what I'm trying to do with my stuff, is bring as many sources as I can in to say something new and something exciting about any period, really. My focus itself is probably the last 200 to 300 years. But I mean, I think all of us at some stage, whatever your speciality is, you've brought in a different source, or you've had to read text, or you've had to understand a scientific study or a process. So that's kind of what I do. And I think everyone kind of does it as well. So it's quite a broad space.
I know, like with historic archaeology, I don't know if anyone else feels this, but it seems to me to be quite daunting, because approaching texts dealing with historical archaeology and historical texts, you don't approach it necessarily in the same way, because there's a lot more nuance, there's a lot more focus on theory and perspective. And if you do tackle these things and you aren't aware of a lot of that, you can miss a lot of information, or you can misread and misinterpret things.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, that's something. Yeah, no, that's something I've been thinking about a lot. Like I've had this idea with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, kind of bouncing around my head about how archaeologists in other kind of sub-disciplines use historical sources, whether they're primary sources by whether it's archival work, or whether it's images, or whether it's maps. How other archaeologists use this. So something we've been thinking about is kind of going through studies in South African archaeology and say the last 20 years, and saying, well, who is using historical sources and how are they using it? Is it just confirming what you found? Is it just trying to find sites? So like you're looking for Tswana town, and you know that a traveler saw this Tswana town. Is that the extent of which you've used that source, just to kind of confirm or deny something? And I think it's got to be a lot more complicated than that. And I think that's where the daunting angle comes in. You're right, Tim. So I'm lucky because my background's in history and anthropology. That was my undergrad, and one of my honors was in history. So I like dealing with the text, but I understand how daunting it can be. So yeah,
cool.
It's a difficult thing, and it's hard to get that across to some students who are coming from a more scientific background. I know from a lot of, and I'm sure you guys in your teaching experience too, when you've got students coming from bio, or who are picking up a module, who are doing engineering or doing something outside of that, for them to write or to read a text or to write something it's almost like, I don't know how to, write an essay. I don't know how to use these sources correctly, because it's just not in our, in our sphere of reference.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, it's a very different way of approaching things, mentally with some of this historical stuff. Matt Kara, you got a question?
Yeah, thanks, Nic. It raises a good point that archaeology really it's a confluence of sort of qualitative and quantitative approaches to try to look at the past, and historical archaeology, more so than what myself and say Matt Lauder do, which is in the ESA, we have no text to deal with. We're more trying to sort of focus on quantitative methods. But in sort of like the younger time periods, you really have to engage with that more. But just maybe because you've given a really nice explanation about how you deal with the qualitative information in text and things, can you maybe just touch upon like what type of quantitative stuff? Because you said archaeometrics, so that sort of implies like measurement of some sort. So can you just give us a little bit of an insight about like what sort of quantitative approaches you engage with?
So I think it comes down to if you're dealing with, trying to give an example now from, I've just finished teaching and working with objects course. So if we're dealing with archaeometrics, a lot of it's to do with, okay, so here's a study, for example, is finding glass scrapers and glass tools at certain sites that are, so they look like lithics. They've got the kind of morphological characteristics. A common technique is to use the bases of bottles, which are a lot thicker, glass bottles from the last 200 years, a lot thicker, as your cores, and to then nap off that and get a stone tool. And then one way, so that's purely, you're looking at morphological features, and this is a process that can happen naturally. If it's trampled on by, if it's up in an open context, it's going to be trampled on by cattle, for argument's sake. How do you then, measure this, or how do you judge whether this is now used as a lithic, or is it purely accidental, quote unquote? Right. And then you're dealing a lot then with how you would analyze lithic tools in fine grained lithic tools. So that's the kind of I'm not au fait with all the different whatever spectrometry, whatever you want to call it at this stage, but that's the one way of doing it. So I think the important thing to remember is that I kind of want to stress and move away from, well, it's only dealing with historical sources and the archaeological sources. It's saying, okay, that's just one method. In my own research, I haven't really needed to deal with that. But in terms of quantitative, it's a lot to do with other angles of how much of something is at a site. How do we look at distribution of things on a site? How do we, just normal, what you would use in your, actually a methodology you would use in your ESA.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, in studies and LSA or Iron Age, and it's just putting it in a different context and recognizing, hey, we've got other sources that can comment on this.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Nick, maybe if I could just jump in there. You spoke about using multiple streams of evidence, looking at qualitative, quantitative data and stuff. Ethnography. Can we touch on ethnography? Does historical archaeology have the same, are there the same issues that there are, with using ethnography for, the LSA, for example? Are there still those kinds of debates? Obviously, you've got written text as well to rely on, especially in your example where you're looking at 200-300 years ago in the past. So how do those debates factor in as well?
Well, there's a lot of interplay. I mean, I know at Tucky's, anthropology and archaeology are on the same floor. And in the US, I think they're basically in the same departments half the time. So there's a lot of interplay there about, so I think it's important that archaeologists in general get an understanding of ethnography and anthropological approaches to deal with sources and to deal with ethnography and the ethnographic equivalents and all that kind of stuff. And I think, one thing you've got to remember too is to treat your sources as ethnography if you're dealing about the written word. Not to take things at face value, to understand that even if you're analyzing texts from 200 years ago written in English by European travelers, there's a lot of, it comes back to what I said before, you can't take these at face value. It's understanding where these people came from. It's understanding what biases are inherent in their views. But ethnography is important. I think Lynn Wadley does a lot of work up in Namakwaland dealing with, I've forgotten the term now, but, can we look at ethnography from 50 years ago or from 100 years ago and actually push it back? It's a common question we all come across, when we're dealing with how far does the ethnographic present really push back?
Yeah, just before you carry on there, sorry, just to jump in there, Nick, it's exactly what John Parkinson's written about and many others. In his 1984 Sakwa and Bushman paper, he speaks exactly about ethnography, and in his argument, if I remember it correctly, it's about this ethnography that's been collected only you can really apply to roughly the historic period. when these interactions and transformations began. So in that sense, to address a bit of your question, is ethnography are not unproblematically, but it does apply to the historical record, and in this case, according to John, probably even more so than the pre-colonial record when it comes down to gatherers. So anyway, sorry, I jumped in there. Carry on.
No, but the interesting thing, sorry, to double jump in here, is that that's kind of where these historic sources become quite useful in a sense, because you are able to have like Parkinson's case, to look at, say, practice from the early 19th century, or that's in people's memories already about how their grandparents lived, and kind of push back into the historic period. But then a big question that I'm thinking about is, can you look at, say, these initial recordings of Khoisan in the Western Cape, say, by these Dutch travelers? Can we use that as a corollary for what was actually really going on amongst Khoisan groups, at the time the Dutch first arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries? Obviously there's biases inherent in those kinds of texts, but is it possible to read these or read between the lines and get something useful out of them, and push back? And I mean, I think you can, but it's a lot of theory, like you said.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I was going to say, sorry, if I can just jump in there, maybe more an observation than a question, but it must be so exciting dealing with texts. I know, the three of us are sitting here saying, gosh, thankfully we don't have to deal with too much text, or obviously Tim would deal with more than Karen, looking at the essay, but it must be so exciting. And I mean, you must have to rein yourself in sometimes, because, you talk about, say, specific biases if you're looking at written reports from different groups and stuff, and whatever, what you can use as an analogy and what you can't. And there must be just so many different aspects to these written texts, and you can head off in different directions and deal with, it must be...
I'm obsessed with these. Like my spare time is on Google Books, looking at some obscure hunter who went up into northern Zululand in 17 Futsak, trying to, and just going like, I literally go, why is no one reading these? Why is no one? I mean, but they're dense texts, and they're all they're not easy to read. But I go like, I just think of questions all the time. I've got a little piece of paper I keep next to my computer. It's just like, okay, well, here's an approach. How did travelers see Khoisan servants in the West Coast in between 1800 and 1830? And you can literally just write a paper on this stuff, summarizing it, because no one, it's tough to get through if you're not coming from. I'm lucky enough to come from, like I said, history and anthropology, so I'm used to these texts.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. That's it's really interesting, and I think we got a bit wrapped up there in that conversation.
We did.
It was really interesting. We didn't even get onto the topic of postdoc, so. Perhaps that's something we can rope you back in another time, and we can deal with postdocs. That was really interesting. So just in the last sort of like minute, these kinds of, there's so much we can learn from this. What do you think some of the important things we can do with historic archaeology in the context of South Africa is?
I think the main thing is to recognize that historical archaeology, or if you want to take it as the archaeology of the last 200 years, is much more knowable to the general public than ESA, than LSA, to Iron Age. People can relate to it a lot more. And this is not, I'm not, speaking on thin air. In my experience, I've been working up in Cedarburg for my previous postdoc. And there I had a lot of instances where people, it's kind of like show them a stone tool and it's like, okay, cool, that's amazing. And say it to ancestors, that's really, really cool. But show them a piece of pottery that their great-great-grandmother might have used, and there's a lot more to relate to. So I think it's a nice entryway to get people to engage with the archaeological record, the public, the community. It's name, you can get names of people. You can say, okay, you know what, in 1802, this person lived here, and this belongs to them, and they used it this way, and that's super relatable to the general public. In my experience, so I think that's a great way. That's how historical archaeology, or the archaeology of the last, say, 300, 400 years, is useful. And I think it's a tool to make it more popular amongst students as well.
That's also such a good point. Yeah, thanks. Well, look, we can go on and on about all of this. It's really interesting. But thanks for coming on. We will hopefully have another chat about postdocs, because this elusive what the hell is a postdoc thing we haven't answered yet.
I was prepared for that. I had all these really smart things to say about postdocs.
You should have told us boring stuff about historic archaeology, then we would have got onto it.
I did give you the boring stuff.
Well, thanks, Nick. Appreciate it. And
guys, thanks. Yeah, for sure. Have a good one.
Cheers.